هموطنان عزیز، امیدوار هستم که جور و صحتمند و سالم باشید. اینک من نسرین مختار بار دیگر در خدمت شما هموطنان عزیز قرار دارم. من در جایی هستم که اینجا کلتورهوس و یا مرکز فرهنگی استکهلم هست. بنابراین شما را دعوت میکنم به یک برنامه فرهنگی، یعنی برنامه شب بودا. متاسفانه نمیتواند در افغانستان تسجیل شود و خوشبختانه امشب در استکهلم، در مرکز فرهنگی استکهلم تسجیل به عمل می آید و شما را دعوت میکنم در تماشای این برنامه فرهنگی و تا با آخر برنامه را با ما باشید و از داشته های برنامه ما لذت ببرین.
In international level. We believe that historical monuments do not belong to a country and its nation. It actually belongs to the whole world, and it belongs to the history of Mother Earth. 10 years before, a group of activists in Afghanistan decided to hold the first A Night with Buddha program in Bamiyan city in Afghanistan in memory of big Buddha statues, and with the aim to prevent any further similar actions by Taliban and to bring the consideration of international communities on the Husseini and Hayat Safi have been invited by Stockholm City through the icon system hosted by Kulturhuset Stadsteatern. Zahra Hosseini and Hayat Safi have been the program manager of the same event in Afghanistan during the last 6 years. After Zahra, the microphone will be passed to Mr. Zia Qasimi. Zia Qasimi is a famous poet and a writer from Afghanistan. His poems were published in 4 books, and he recently wrote two novels, Zemistan, Winter, and When the Musa Was Killed is his books. And I should happily mention that we have Mrs. Caroline Donat with us. She's an actor, a writer, and one of the Axel von fashion nerds with us. She will read the translation of poems tonight. Zahrajan, stage is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to A Night with Buddha, an evening of poetry, music, and discussion, visitors and pilgrims from East and West. Before and around that time, they dynamited the Buddha statues. The Taliban massacred thousands of civilians, overwhelmingly in Mazar Sharif and in different locations in Bamiyan. One of the most horrific massacres took place in my birthplace, Yakaulang districts of Bamiyan, where civilians were rounded up, tortured, and shot dead in a cold ball. To the Taliban, there was nothing more meaningless than the obligation to protect heritage sites, respect Afghanistan cultural and ethnic diversity of abide by international, instead of being brought to justice and their regime made accountable. Are back in power. Sadly, the international community to a large extent have been complacent and indifferent. The empty ancients of Buddha statues today stand as a strict monument to Taliban's enmity to cultural and civilizational heritage, and the people who carried them for centuries. Today, the same governor who oversaw the destructions of the statues and massacres of Bamyan people is ruling the province once again. He has banned the public from visiting historical sites, and illegal digging and excavations continue in protected areas. The Taliban views to governance, human rights, and culture have remained the same since they were overthrown in late 2001. In the past 20 years, they made their way to power through violence, destruction, and exploitations of communities. Desperate situation in Afghanistan, including using tactics such as suicide bombing of civilian infrastructures, schools, and hospitals. After the Taliban took over Afghanistan in August 2021, freedom of expression has been severely restricted. Journalists and analysts have been abdicated and tortured. Women activists have been disappeared, tortured.
I'd like to thank the organizer of such a very important meeting. So my mission is to make a presentation about the political consequences of Buddha's destruction in Afghanistan. So why the politics destroy art and culture. So that's my presentation. I will take 15 minutes of yours. To make this presentation, you need to look briefly about the recent history of Afghanistan, especially in the past 40 years. I start with the Soviet invasion to Afghanistan. Late 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Right after the invasion of the Soviets in the western part of Afghanistan, the Mujahideen groups started to mobilize themselves to struggle against the Soviets in Afghanistan. During this period of time, in the United States of America, President Carter was leading the White House. The National Security Advisor, Mr. Brzezinski of Mr. Carter, organized an extraordinary meeting for the president, so-called "It is the Time." Mr. Brzezinski, during this meeting, presented his doctrine how to struggle against Soviets in Afghanistan. And then President Carter asked him, "Why do you call this meeting, it is the time?" And then Brzezinski explained that this is the time to get revenge of the Soviets' Vietnam War in Afghanistan. Then Mr. Carter asked him, "How do you do it?" And then he said, "Let's support the Islamists, the jihadists who are struggling against the Soviet." Then Mr. Carter has approved a budget of $80 million to the project. Right after that, Mr. Brzezinski traveled to the Riyadh, capital city of Saudi Arabia, and met with Mr. Faisal Turki, who was the head of intelligence service. Mr. Turki was a key person in the political atmosphere in the Saudi Arabia. Then Mr. Brzezinski, together with Mr. Faisal, traveled to Pakistan to meet with General Ziaul Haq, the president of Pakistan. General Ziaul Haq listened to the doctrine of Mr. Brzezinski. He loved the doctrine. Why? Because he was the leader of Muslim League. Himself, he was an Islamist. The second, he could make a lot of money for Pakistan through this project. He welcomed the idea, and then Mr. Brzezinski, Mr. Faisal, and Mr. Abu Bakr Rahman, who was the leader of ISI, Pakistani Intelligence Service, traveled to the border area between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they met the leaders of Mujahideens. Mr. Brzezinski explained his doctrine to the leaders of Mujahideen. The leaders of Mujahideens loved the idea. Why? Because from one hand, they could struggle, mobilize themselves against the Soviets. From another hand, they could make a lot of money, the leaders. Then Mr. Brzezinski came back to the United States and told the success history of his travel to the region to the National Security Advisors and the President of the United States, Mr. Carter. Right after that, Mr. Carter approved 150 million of US dollars to the project. Then the Mujahideens get a lot of money and could gain a lot of area in Afghanistan. And the jihadists could mobilize themselves to struggle village by village and cities by cities in Afghanistan. When Mr. Reagan, who was the successor of Mr. Carter, came to the power, he followed up step by step the doctrine of Brzezinski. He even went further on. He invited all the leaders of Mujahideen to the White House. Do you know who was the leader of the Mujahideen's delegation visiting the White House? Mr. Jalaluddin Haqqani, who became the most sophisticated and complicated terrorist network in all over the world. Then the Mujahideen came back to Afghanistan. The trust fund of supporting Mujahideen increased up to 450 million of US dollars. Pakistan has organized a bank of coordination for Islamic support in Mujahideen against the Soviet invasion. Then the Mujahideen got a lot of support, not only from the United States, but from Western countries, the European countries, and the Gulf countries. The support, the sum of support for the Mujahideens even reached up to 700 million of US dollars per year. The Mujahideen could get cities by cities and gain the grounds in Afghanistan. 10 years later, the Soviets left the country. And 2 years after that, the pro-Soviet government led by President Najib has resigned and the Mujahideens came to the power. 8 Mujahideen groups from Iran and 7 Mujahideen groups from Pakistan came to Afghanistan. What they've done in Afghanistan as soon as they got the power, they started fighting against each other. Although it was a momentum for Mujahideens to rebuild the country, ask the Western and Eastern countries to rebuild Afghanistan. But instead of that, they struggled for the power. Only Kabul has been divided in 15 military zones, and the Mujahideens struggled for these zones. 15 Mujahideen groups, we call them Tanzims, they struggled for the power in the capital city, and they destroyed the infrastructure of Kabul, Herat, Mazar, big cities. 200,000 of Afghans have been killed. 2 million have been displaced. 1.8 million have been migrated from Afghanistan. During this period of time, people of Afghanistan get really tired of Mujahideens because they were looters. And the idea, a new doctrine has been appeared. It was a doctrine of Benazir Bhutto in her Minister of Interior Affairs, Mr. Babur. They supported a new emerged political, fanatical phenomena in the south part of Afghanistan, in the district of Maiwand of Kandahar province. They called themselves the Taliban. The Taliban have put for themselves three missions. The first, to gain the power, political power. The second, to illustrate themselves as the most restricted Islamic political system in the globe. And the third, to destroy any kind of diversity, social, economic, cultural, and political diversity. They got a lot of support from Pakistan because Mujahideens couldn't make a power in Afghanistan. And then Pakistan supported the Taliban in order to bring an alternative for Mujahideens. At that period of time, Afghan people welcomed the Taliban because they needed security and peace. The Taliban promised that. And then soon the Taliban got a lot of support from Pakistan and from people in Afghanistan. And then they gained the same areas from Kandahar to Zabul, Nuristan, Farah, Helmand, and then came to the center. During 2 years, the Taliban could organize themselves as a strong political power. In 1996, the Taliban captured Kabul city. As soon as they get the power, they came to discuss about these three missions. The first one, to organize a strong political Islamic state. The second, destroy any kind of diversity. They started to destroy, first of all, the cultural diversity. And Buddha was a victim of that. So, the Taliban actually was the most fanatic institution in all over the world. They imposed people for not having fundamental rights. So let me make my point for this presentation and finish my presentation. My point is, I would like to ask myself, who's the guilty of destroying the Buddha in Afghanistan? Maybe all of us say, this is the Taliban. Yes, the Taliban are guilty. They are the tools. They did it. But who paved the way for the Talibanism? If we look to the history of Afghanistan, recent history to Afghanistan, when the communists come to the power, they struggled for their own agenda, not respecting the people's notion, the religion, the culture. And they struggled against themselves, Khalq and Parchams. When the Mujahideen come to power, they struggled for their own interest, forgetting about the national unity, and destroyed the country. Actually, it was the political system who paved the way for Taliban.